Before we begin, this month's YouTube channel shoutout goes to Katrina W. Her channel specializes in live streams and deep dives into the game No Man's Sky. Personally, I have invested many hours into that game. The story behind the development of No Man's Sky is quite interesting, going from an industry pariah and growing over time to become a well-polished, content-rich, and quite entertaining game. If you're at all interested in No Man's Sky, check out her channel. The link is in the description box below. In the United States, political opinions have evolved over the past 100 years or so. America has become more progressive in some areas, more authoritarian in others, more prosperous, more destitute, better in some areas, and in other areas much worse. As our ideologies have fractured and changed, how we treat our servicemen and women has varied from patriotic worship as national heroes to being maligned and vilified as killers. After each major conflict of the past century, there has been some common ways veterans have been treated, and as we will discuss today, some ways were very different. 1918, the end of World War I. Upon returning home, veterans of World War I were treated as heroes for a bit. Then it seems in many ways the country fell apart around them. Finding employment, support from the US government, and adapting to a rapidly changing home front were huge issues for veterans. And this is a theme that will repeat itself for every war thereafter. I found this from the National World War I Museum and Memorial website. It reads, "The home that soldiers returned to was quite different than the one they left in 1917-1918. Prohibition, criminalizing the sale of alcohol, was in effect nationwide after decades of advocating by various temperance groups. The majority of women federally gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920. Additionally, many women were not eager to abandon the economic and social freedoms enjoyed during the war. There was also societal and political unrest with the first Red Scare, labor agitations, and violent race riots. Veterans, feeling abandoned by the government that they served and supported, increasingly argued for Congress to assist with their welfare, finally achieving passage of a post-dated bonus bond in 1924. Unfortunately, at the very time that these bonds came due and were needed the most, the country collapsed into the Great Depression. This led veterans to march on Washington, D.C. in 1932, only to be forcibly turned away by the very military they served during World War I. 1945, the end of World War II. After World War II, history repeated itself. Upon returning, most soldiers were welcomed with open arms and ticker tape parades. And once again, the country entered an economic downturn. Not much was known about treating issues like PTSD, and support for our veterans after the fighting was over was lacking. I found this from Delta College about life after World War II. Traditionally, America has always supported its armed forces and has shown great respect for those in uniform. In 1919, at the end of World War I, the Doughboys returned home from Europe to ticker tape victory parades, marching bands, speeches, and the goodwill of all Americans. Additionally, when the soldiers returned home from World War II, they were also treated as heroes. A euphoric atmosphere overtook the nation, and celebrations were held in their honor all around the country. Unfurled American flags that decorated the streets and homes could be seen waving in the breeze. It was as if they too were welcoming home the GIs. The reveling continued non-stop for weeks. It seemed as though the nation and its citizens could not do enough for the returning servicemen and women. A grateful nation was anxious to show its admiration and support for the returning soldiers. 1953, the end of the Korean War. The Korean War was the first major conflict that did not heavily impact the daily lives of civilian Americans. There was no fear that the Korean communists were going to be assaulting the West Coast from across the Pacific. Veterans, as in the previous two wars, came back to a lack of support from the government, but now, for the first time, waning support from the public. I found this article from the Wilson Center about what life was like for returning veterans from the Korean War. While there was some economic displacement from the massive spending of the war, its limited nature meant that Americans were not involved in the war work. This was especially remarkable because both in World War I and World War II, war work and the ethos of sacrifice reached all levels of U.S. society. The Korean War was the first war the U.S. waged without massive disruptions to daily life. This only added to the sense of alienation many Korean War veterans felt as they returned home. More than one veteran recalled returning home as a lonely experience. Thomas Nightingale, a medic, recalled his friends had forgotten where he'd been. Another veteran said, "No one else seemed to miss me very much. Families and friends welcomed them home, but there would be no uproarious celebrations like those that followed the end of World War II. The way U.S. veterans were treated after the Korean War would be an indication of things to come. On the political front, wars were no longer wars, merely police actions. This would be true for everyone except for those actually fighting in Korea and Vietnam. The war industries across the U.S. would not be mobilized. People were not asked to sacrifice and do their part the way they were in World War I and World War II. There was no longer a feeling of actually being at war on the home front." 1975, the end of the Vietnam War. The aftermath of the Vietnam War was a low point in American history and society. Not only was there a lack of support for our returning vets, but in many cases, they were vilified. I found this article from humanities.org. The Vietnam War and its veterans have powerfully influenced American political currents and cultural beliefs ever since. America's faith in itself as a kind and righteous nation was deeply shaken by the open barbarity of the war. Carpet bombings, Zippo squads, napalm, body counts, all were presented in vivid color in the pages of Life magazine and others. The press had never before, nor has since, revealed such stark truth about the ugliness of America's wars. Anti-war activism was spurred by the deep sense that the war was cruel and anathema to America's moral identity. For the first and only time in the nation's history, thousands of veterans publicly marched in opposition to their war. Veterans returned from Vietnam not with their battalion or company, but alone on a plane after their 365-day tour. Many of them were anguished by their countrymen's condemnation of the war, felt abandoned by their government, and suffered grievous physical and psycho-spiritual injuries. One of the soldiers who endured those physical and psychological injuries was John James Rambo, decorated Green Beret, an exceptional survivalist and killer. Rambo learned the skills needed to survive in extremely harsh conditions. However, all of the fighting and suffering left Rambo scarred deeply. John Rambo returned to a very different America than the one he left. There was a growing narrative that U.S. soldiers were committing savage and brutal acts while in the field. However, regardless of how Americans felt about the war itself, the soldiers themselves were caught in those broad strokes by accident or by design. But beyond all that, the combination of coming home to a hostile reception and a lack of post-war support led to Vietnam vets finding adjusting to life at home to be significantly more challenging. Change by itself is enough to lead to conflict. Change added to challenge is a recipe for disaster. One of the most telling and tragic examples of this happened 40 years ago in Hope, Washington. John Rambo, a Vietnam vet, was down on his luck, unable to adjust to civilian life, and hitchhiking across the U.S. looking to reunite with other soldiers from his unit. Upon finding his friend Delmar had not only died of cancer, but died of a cancer likely caused by Agent Orange used during the war, John was left alone and forced to keep on his journey without end. His next stop would be further up the West Coast, passing through Hope, Washington. What happened next caused a conflict between Rambo and the full might of Hope's law enforcement power. What Hope didn't know, but would soon find out, was that Rambo was no ordinary soldier. he would prove to be much more than they bargained for, and much, much more than they could handle. This is the story of 1982's First Blood.
You don't seem to want to accept the fact that you're dealing with an expert in guerrilla warfare.
The story of First Blood, the movie, directed by Ted Kotcheff, is a story of primal human conflict. Not so much about man versus man combat, but a conflict of ideologies, a conflict of ideas that was not only inevitable, but one that echoes and repeats throughout history. And as all history proves, First Blood provided us with a valuable lesson for us to take with us. First Blood is the story of John Rambo, Vietnam vet and highly trained Green Beret. However, the war is over. His skills as a survivalist and a soldier are no longer needed. From outward appearances, he no longer even appears to be anything more than a vagrant. His hair is long and shaggy, his clothes are torn and tattered. From all the events that have happened to him, he carries that 1,000-yard stare. All of these make him stand out from normal civilian society. Hope, Washington was a small mountain town where everyone knew everyone else. The town sheriff and de facto leader was Will Teasel. He was a veteran himself, but his fight was in the Korean War during that conflict. As a side note, and to repeat something that was mentioned earlier, it is explained in the novel and some of the history that I read that there was a tension between veterans of the Korean War and veterans of the Vietnam War. Essentially, veterans of the Vietnam War felt like they were being looked down upon by Korean War vets because of their shorter tours of duty, some only a year, and how history focuses more so on the Vietnam War while ignoring the Korean War. That's one of the reasons that the Korean War is referred to as the Forgotten War. Now, I wasn't around for the Korean War, so keep this in mind. I'm just reporting what I've read. The novel First Blood, written by David Morrell, goes much deeper into the characterization of Sheriff Teasel and John Rambo, and how they differ greatly than what was eventually shown in the First Blood movie. We'll go deeper into some of the differences later. But one of the points of contention between Teasel and Rambo in the novel is that tension between Korean War veterans and Vietnam War veterans. Sheriff Teasel is brass tacks, but charismatic. The kind of guy who's no nonsense, but greets everyone in town by their first name. A veteran himself, he has created a sense of order and tranquility and hope, and will do what it takes to maintain that order. One day, Rambo walks into town. Hope is not his destination, just another small, unwelcome town on his way west. Immediately, Sheriff Teasel spots Rambo and identifies him as a stranger and a potential threat. From his appearance, it is clear Rambo does not belong in Hope. Sheriff Teasel at first plays the good cop, but very quickly the bad cop emerges.
It's a quiet little town. In fact, you might say it's boring. But that's the way we like it. And I get paid to keep it that way. Boring.
Teasel drives Rambo to the edge of town and sends him packing with an overt threat never to return to Hope. Rambo, lost in society, abandoned by his government, and finding only further pain and suffering back home in America, has had just about as much pushing around as he can take. He immediately turns around, walks in the opposite direction of his journey, and walks back into Hope. Rambo is immediately arrested by Teasel. Teasel and his deputies proceed to overplay their hand, roughing up Rambo, threatening him, beating him because, to them, he's subhuman, someone unworthy of a bit of respect or human decency. During a particularly sadistic beating, an attempt was made to shave Rambo's head. The combination of the detainment, the beatings, and the shine of the razor blade pushed Rambo over the edge. He starts having flashbacks to the war in Vietnam. He reverts back to his training and clobbers the entire staff of the police station and escapes into the forest surrounding Hope. At that point, Teasel could have let Rambo go, but we both know that was never going to happen. One of Teasel's deputies, Deputy Sheriff Galt, having his ass kicked by Rambo and having his pride hurt, defies orders and tries to kill Rambo. Pursuing Rambo via helicopter, Galt pushes the pilot to take dangerous risks to get a clear shot of Rambo through his deer rifle. As a result, Galt falls from the helicopter and dies upon impact with the rocky ravine below. I point this moment out because, shockingly, this is the only kill in Rambo. We'll go into the unfortunate irony in just a bit, but another consequence is that Rambo is now understanding that it's not just his freedom he's running for, but his own life. Rambo would have to pursue an appropriate defense if he wants to survive. This is what he was trained to do. This is what made him so valuable to the US government during the war, and why he was so expendable after the war ended. What unfolds for the remainder of the movie is the growth in numbers of armed law enforcement and ultimately soldiers that are pursuing Rambo. For his part, Rambo gradually eliminates these threats as he's been trained. Silently, he disables one pursuer after another. Fortunately for them, he merely wounds them, just enough to take them out of the hunt. This is very different than the novel. The Rambo of the novel was too far gone and had a huge body count. The Rambo of the movie had a sliver of humanity left and chooses to wound his attackers instead of killing them. Events keep getting worse and worse for both Rambo and his pursuers. The situation was spiraling out of control. In walks Colonel Sam Troutman, the officer who trained Rambo. He shares a bit about Rambo's background, training, and the role he played in Vietnam. He attempts to de-escalate the situation by having Sheriff Teasel back off in order to give Rambo some space and time to cool down. Teasel, who is not one to take advice, especially from the colonel who created Rambo, does not follow Troutman's advice. In the end, Rambo turns the tables and emerges from the forest and takes the fight right into town, drawing the battle back to the police station, where he was first detained and abused. After a final confrontation with Teasel, Rambo disables him, nearly killing him. At that point, Rambo is trapped inside the police station. The entirety of the area's law enforcement and now National Guard have the station surrounded. Rambo is ready for a final showdown, knowing he will not survive. Troutman, who predicted Rambo's actions, tries to defuse the situation first as a commanding officer.
It's over!
Nothing is over! Nothing! You just don't turn it off! It wasn't my war! You asked me, I didn't ask you! And I did what I had to do to win, but somebody wouldn't let us win!
Then I came back to the world, and I see all these maggots at the airport, protesting me, spitting, calling me a baby killer, and all kinds of vile crap. Who are they to protest me? Then Troutman leans in as almost a father figure. And finally, after years of buildup, Rambo breaks down emotionally, and all of his anguish comes flowing out. This scene, for me, was so hard to understand because of the pace of Sylvester Stallone's speech and the emotions and trauma he's trying to convey through his acting. It's worth it to slow it down and listen to each sentence. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd like to read to you from a script I found online. Oh my God, where is everybody? Oh God, I had a friend who was Danforth. I had all these guys, man. Back there, I had all these f***ing guys who were my friends. Because back there, there's nothing. Remember Danforth? He wore this black headband, and I took one of those magic markers, and I said, Pharaon, hey, mail us to Las Vegas, because we're always talking about Vegas, and this fucking car. This, red 58 Chevy convertible. He was talking about this car. He said we're gonna cruise till the tires fall off. Then he pauses. We were at this bar in Saigon, and this kid comes up. This kid carrying a shoe shine box. And he says, shine please, shine. I said no. And, he kept asking, yeah. And Joey said yeah. And I went to go get a couple beers. And the box was wired. And he opened up the box. Fucking blew his body all over the place. And he's just laying there, and he's fucking screaming. These pieces of him all over me, just like, through frustration, he grabs the bullet chain strapped from around his chest and yanks it off. Like this. And I'm trying to pull them off, you know. And my friend, it's all over me. It's got blood and everything. And I'm trying to hold him together. I put him together. His fucking insides keep coming out. And nobody would help. Nobody helped me. He's saying, please, I want to go home. I want to go home. He keeps calling my name. I want to go home, Johnny. I want to drive my Chevy. I said, well, at this point, he's so upset. He's breaking down. He's crying. Why can't I find your fucking legs? I can't find your legs. Then almost at a whisper, he says,
I can't get out of my head. I do this 7 years. Every day it hurts. Sometimes I wake up, I don't know where I am. I don't talk to anybody. Sometimes a day. Sometimes a week. I can't put it out of my mind.
At this point, he's completely broken down and sobbing. When people think of First Blood and Rambo, they typically get a vision of Rambo 2 and Rambo 3, the oiled-up, bandana-wearing, hyper-muscular Sylvester Stallone caricature that became a cultural explosion and an international meme. However, First Blood is a very different story than the sequels. First Blood is much more serious and relatively quiet and tense. It's really much more of a thriller than an action movie, at least until the third act. There's an actual attempt to deliver a message in First Blood. Whether it was effective or not is up to you. The sequels, however, took all the wrong lessons from the success of First Blood and ran with them. Rambo is remembered for killing commies in Vietnam and Afghanistan, while First Blood is much more of a serious look at the consequences of war and returning home from war with damage both external and internal. While it is unfortunate that Rambo's story devolved into such mindless schlock, I'm a little satisfied that, as a cultural reference, there is a clear separation between Rambo the action hero and Rambo the tragic character. This is really what makes First Blood so much more of an important story than the junk that came after. But, as with most movies from the 70s and 80s, the production of First Blood was rife with issues. After watching a rough cut of the film, which was about 3 hours long, Sylvester Stallone and his agent claimed that the film was so bad that it made them sick. Stallone also feared that the film would kill his career, and he attempted to buy all the footage and destroy it. When he couldn't do that, he suggested that the producers cut much of his part and let the rest of the characters tell the story. After heavy edits, the film was cut down to 93 minutes, which inadvertently set a precedent for the length of future action movies. Of course now, when Sylvester Stallone ranks his preference for his Rambo films, he ranks this one as first, his favorite, and he, quote, wouldn't change a thing about it. A lot of the problems came from the adaptation of David Morrell's novel. Sylvester Stallone, who helped write the screenplay, and the producers wanted to make Rambo a different type of character in the film than he was in the book. They didn't want him to be a psychotic, cold-blooded killer like he was in the book, and thankfully, decided to make him a man who was lost and didn't know what to do with his life, and was a victim of circumstance. Stallone also decided to have Rambo not kill the cops or the National Guardsmen, as in the novel, in which Rambo killed plenty of them. Then there was the casting. At that point in his career, Stallone had Rocky, which was a huge achievement. But after that, it was a series of duds. Nowadays, we consider Stallone to be a huge action star, but at the time, his career path was not certain. And when he got the role of Rambo, he had not had another successful movie since Rocky. The list of actors initially considered for the role of John Rambo was substantial. We need to keep in mind that when we hear that an actor was, quote, considered for a role, it could be anywhere between an actual offer being made, or someone was doing a little too much coke one night and said, wouldn't it be cool if insert actor here played Rambo? I like to mention these names for similar reasons, not because of my coke habit, but because I think it's fun to imagine these actors playing such an iconic role. Ready? Chuck Norris, Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen, Al Pacino, Jeff Bridges, Robert De Niro, Michael Douglas, Paul Newman, Nick Nolte, Ryan O'Neal, John Travolta, and Chris Christopherson. So, essentially everybody was up for this role. Chris Christopherson's offer was a bit more serious for a few reasons. First, and unbeknownst to me, not only did he serve, but he was an Army Ranger. The producers thought this would add some authenticity to the film and help Christopherson with the role. Second, apparently Christopherson was friends with Sam Peckinpah. Through later interviews, it is clear there was a hope that if Christopherson was offered the role of Rambo, then he might just be able to persuade Peckinpah to direct the film. Could you imagine a Sam Peckinpah directed First Blood? That would truly be something to behold. However, I am still very pleased about how First Blood turned out under Ted Kotcheff. One of the major reasons they had to dig so deep to find actors willing to play the role was how Rambo was written in the novel. In the novel, Rambo is the protagonist, but he's a brutal killer and not a troubled good guy that audiences could sympathize with. According to interviews with producers and Stallone himself, many of the actors on that list were uncomfortable with the lead character being, at best, morally gray, and at worst, a cold-blooded murderer. More than one actor, including Stallone himself, considered the role to be potentially a career ender. Thankfully, it was not. Stallone, when he was still trying to be a writer and an actor, had fortune shine upon him again, and First Blood turned out to be one of the best movies of the 1980s. Rambo is a complex character, and if there's any fault to be found is that Stallone, the writer, was sloppy in his method of developing the audience's understanding of how emotionally damaged Rambo was. There were 26 drafts of the script before Sylvester Stallone wrote the final script. Stallone refers to his character as a kind of Frankenstein's monster, only the monster wasn't created by a mad scientist, it was created by the American government. That's a great point to study and discuss, but we really don't get into it with the exception of 3 isolated scenes. The first scene when he goes and visits his army buddy who was deceased, a little bit when he's talking on the radio with Troutman from the cave, and a whole bunch of it at the end. It could have been woven into the story a little bit more delicately, but hey, nobody's perfect. A lot of hesitation came from the studio about Rambo's final breakdown in the film, and that's why I wanted to read it word for word to you for this video. Stallone fought tooth and nail for that scene, noting he felt the soldiers who were going through similar pushback from society needed their story to be told. The story Rambo rants about in those final moments are apparently real stories that Stallone heard in researching the role and developing the screenplay. And it's those stories that I think push First Blood over the top from just entertainment to valued perspective. Nowadays in American culture, it would be abhorrent and shameful to treat soldiers the way Rambo is treated. And one could debate whether Rambo's suffering excuses his actions in Hope, Washington. Unfortunately, not many people start a conversation about Rambo with First Blood. They really start with Rambo 2, which is a tragedy unto itself. For some, the question remains, is Rambo a sympathetic character as depicted in First Blood? The answer is yes, for 2 reasons. First and foremost, the sheriff's department, led by Will Teasel, provoked the situation which led to the events spiraling out of control. Rambo was not breaking the law, he wasn't loitering around Hope, and as far as anyone could tell, he was just passing through. By his own words, he was just stopping for a bite to eat and then moving on. The bigger issue with the sheriff's department's actions is the feeling of what I like to call power from immunity. Because there is no fear of consequence, Teasel and his men believe they can do what they feel is needed, which, of course, slips into believing they can do whatever they want. By the way, this is one of those cautionary tales for all forms of power. When we look back at history, sometimes we ask how a group of humans could be so barbaric, so immoral, seemingly beyond reason. The answer, as implied in First Blood, is simple. They act that way because they can. And since I'm already on my soapbox, The second reason John Rambo should be considered a sympathetic character, in my opinion, despite the numerous laws he broke, is found when we look at what Vietnam vets went through, especially those on high-value missions, such as the Green Berets or Special Forces. It is hard for some people to imagine the grueling conditions soldiers face during wartime, and even when there is relative peace. There's really two things that come to my mind when trying to fully understand what motivated Rambo's actions. Looking back, it is clear that at times our government has sent our armed forces into the jaws of conflict for immoral and/or illegitimate reasons. Furthermore, while in the field, soldiers are put in situations where, through their own choices or because of their orders, they are required to commit horrible acts, those that stick with you for a long time after the war is over. To make that problem even worse, when we look at the resources and services available to our veterans, lacking is a word I would use. Even now, navigating through the bureaucracy of the Veterans Administration in order to get health care can be a nightmare for a large percentage of our veterans, and that's now in modern times. Going back to the Vietnam War or the Korean War, it only gets worse. Today, we have many more non-governmental advocates whose mission is to help veterans get back on their feet after returning from conflict. Charities such as the Wounded Warrior Project, the Fisher House, and the Semper Fi Fund have existed for years and still maintain a high level of credibility amongst donors and those receiving services from them. I will put links to their websites in the description below. I hope this video serves as a reminder that the first Rambo, the one that wandered through Hope, Washington, is the one we should have listened to. Sadly, there are stories like Rambo's after every war. The systemic problems that our veterans face that cause the fictional events of First Blood go largely unaddressed. I'm not saying this to lay blame on anyone, and I really don't want to end this video with a downer. I'm saying this because it's embarrassing that a country of our wealth and means would still struggle to do the right thing. The thing that comes to mind when discussing First Blood is that maybe, just maybe, if we do the right thing, we can learn the lessons from the fictional story of Rambo and prevent it from ever becoming a reality again. Thank you for watching.